The dawn broke slow over the far edge of the prairie, its light spilling like warm honey across a land that had learned to survive on very little. Grass bent under a dry wind, carrying the smell of dust and the faint memory of rain from somewhere far away. The small town of Ash Hollow lay still in the quiet hours, the air holding that expectant pause before the day began in earnest. A few thin lines of smoke rose from chimneys. Somewhere, a rooster sounded hoarse from overuse. On the outskirts, where the land rolled down toward the creek, stood a weather-worn homestead with clapboard walls faded to the color of old bone. The fence leaned in places, the roof wore scars from storms, and the porch steps groaned under any weight they were given. Yet, there was a stubborn kind of grace to the place, as though it had decided to keep standing no matter what time or weather demanded. Inside lived Clara Rosefield. She was not yet 30, but the years had pressed themselves into her posture, into the way she carried her shoulders, into the stillness of her gaze. Her hair, long in the muted shade of river silt, was tied back without much thought, and her eyes, gray, the color of a sky thinking about snow, had learned to measure a person before they came close enough to touch her life. 2 years widowed, she worked the land alone, raising small crops, keeping a milk cow, tending to hens. Her hands were rougher than they had once been, and though she still smiled from time to time, the smile often carried an aftertaste of memory. Her husband, Thomas, had been kind in his quiet way, but death had taken him without warning. A mine collapse, gone before supper. That had been a hard winter. The harder part came before him, years back, when another man, Silas Boone, had courted her with the swagger of youth. Silas had walked away after she lost a child in the first year of marriage, leaving her with the sting of whispered talk and the feeling of being measured and found lacking. In a place like Ash Hollow, a woman alone was a story that people told for their own entertainment. Clara had stopped listening. The morning passed in the way most did. She moved through her chores, carrying buckets from the well, scattering feed for the chickens, patching the thin spot in the barn roof where last week's wind had lifted a few shingles. She worked with the rhythm of someone used to solitude. There was no one to share a cup of coffee with, no one to ask about her day. The air was full of the quiet that comes not from peace, but from absence. The knock came in the stillness after noon. Heavy, slow, deliberate. The kind of knock that belonged to someone unafraid of waiting for an answer. Clara set down the basket of washed linens and stepped toward the front door, every sound in the house suddenly sharper. The boards under her feet, the faint whinny of a horse outside, the creak of the porch under another's weight. On the other side of the screen stood Elias Crow. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, dressed in a worn trail coat the color of rain-soaked earth. His hat brim shaded a face made older by sun and dust, though his eyes, blue, startling in the midday light, were steady and calm. The air about him carried the scent of leather and smoke, the kind of smell that clung to a man who had slept under more sky than roof. His voice came low and even, the kind that rolled slow like distant thunder. "I was told you're alone, Clara. Let me give you sons, woman." The words fell between them like a stone dropped into deep water. They rippled outward, touching places in her heart she hadn't opened in years. The meaning was tangled, plain enough on the surface, yet holding something else beneath. He did not say it as a boast, nor with the leering edge she had learned to expect from certain men in town. He spoke as if making a proposal about weathering a storm together, about planting a field and tending it through to harvest. Still, the bluntness of it lit a flare of caution in her. Her fingers tightened against the doorframe. "That's a bold thing to bring to a woman's porch, Elias Crow." "Maybe so," he replied. "But bold is sometimes the only way a man knows to speak truth." Clara studied him for a moment longer. The wind shifted, lifting a strand of her hair, carrying the smell of his horse and the faint metallic tang of a long trail ride. He didn't press the silence. She told him she had chores yet to finish, her tone polite but cool, and watched as he tipped his hat and stepped back, boots sounding heavy on the porch. He left without another word, riding slow down the track toward town, dust rising behind him. The afternoon stretched on, but her mind kept circling back to that knock, that voice, that strange, direct offering. She'd known Elias by sight. Everyone in Ash Hollow had. He drifted in and out of the territory, never staying longer than a season, working cattle drives, mending fences for pay, keeping to himself. Folks called him reliable in work, quiet in company. And yet here he was, speaking of sons and a life as if they were things one could promise by will alone. Evening fell, painting the prairie in deep gold and purple. Clara carried her supper, beans and bread, out to the porch. The rocking chair creaked under her. She looked out toward the horizon where Elias had gone. Somewhere out there, he was likely bedding down near a campfire, or maybe he'd found a corner in May Callahan's boarding house. The question pressed at her. What kind of man speaks so plain and why to her? 3 days passed before she saw him again. She was mending the latch on the chicken coop when she noticed the trough by the barn was full, though she hadn't yet drawn water that morning. No note, no words. But the bucket was left leaning against the fence in a way that said someone had been there with quiet intent. That night, a light rain pattered against the roof, and she found herself wondering if Elias had gotten caught in it. The thought surprised her enough that she frowned at it in the dark, as if it were an intruder. The next morning, she walked into town for flour and salt. Elias was outside the general store, speaking with Sheriff Boyd, his hand resting lightly on his horse's withers. He glanced her way, gave a nod, nothing more, and went back to his conversation. That lack of pressing unsettled her more than pursuit would have. May Callahan, bustling behind the counter of the store, caught Clara's glance through the window. "You be careful with that one," May said quietly. "Men like Elias Crow, they're made of trail dust and horizon lines. They don't settle easy." Clara thought about that on her walk home. She had known men who stayed and men who left. Both could be dangerous to a woman's peace, though in different ways. The problem was knowing which kind you were speaking to before it was too late. 2 more days passed without sight of him. Clara told herself she was relieved. And she was. Until the afternoon, the sky grew dark with the strange yellow-gray of a prairie storm. The wind came in hot and fast, snapping at the grass. Then, without warning, the crack of dry lightning split the sky, striking somewhere to the west. She smelled the fire before she saw it. Sharp, acrid, the kind that makes the skin prickle with old animal instincts. By the time she reached the barn, a thin line of smoke was visible beyond the far fence, curling low and fast in the wind. The grass fire was moving toward her land. She worked quickly, untying the cow, driving the chickens into their coop, but the heat was building. The barn, Thomas's tools, his saddle, the things she had kept because she could not bear to let them go, stood in the fire's path. She grabbed a bucket, filled it from the trough, and ran toward the barn, heart pounding in her ears. The smoke thickened, stinging her eyes, turning the air into a curtain she could barely see through. She coughed, stumbled, sloshed water onto the dry boards. A gust of wind sent sparks into the air, and for a moment she thought she had lost it all. Then an arm, strong, steady, wrapped around her waist, pulling her clear. Through the haze, Elias's face emerged, streaked with soot, eyes fierce but calm. He shoved the bucket into her hands, took another himself, and together they fought the creeping edge of the fire, stamping and dousing until the worst of it broke. The smell of char hung heavy, but the barn still stood, scarred but standing. When it was over, they leaned against the fence, breathing hard. Elias turned to her, voice quiet under the hiss of cooling embers. "I don't care if there's never a child, Clara. I only care there's you." The words sank deeper than the smoke had. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel the need to answer right away. The fire had been beaten back, but something else, something long shut away, was beginning to stir in its place.